While aviation historians have long celebrated the North American P-51 Mustang as the premier Allied fighter of World War II, the true workhorse of American air power was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. This massive, rugged aircraft served as the backbone of U.S. fighter operations, representing nearly half of all American fighters deployed overseas during the war's final 18 months. The Thunderbolt's contributions to victory have been unjustly overshadowed by its more glamorous contemporaries. The P-47, working alongside the long-range Lockheed P-38 Lightning, established Allied air supremacy over Western Europe. In the vast Pacific theater, it ranked as the second most utilized fighter aircraft. Most significantly, the Thunderbolt pioneered the fighter-bomber role that would define modern air warfare tactics still employed by today's United States Air Force. Republic Aircraft Corporation entered the 1940 fighter competition determined to create an American warplane capable of matching the German fighters dominating European skies. Based in Farmingdale, New York, Republic had emerged from the corporate restructuring of Alexander Seversky's aviation company. Seversky, a Russian-born designer, had previously created America's first modern fighter, the P-35, followed by the P-43 Lancer, which failed to gain Army acceptance. In 1939, internal corporate politics removed Seversky from his own company while he was in Europe attempting to sell his designs to the British. The remaining leadership promptly renamed the enterprise Republic Aircraft. Republic's initial fighter proposal centered around a compact, lightweight design powered by the Allison V-12 engine. Alexander Kartveli, who had collaborated closely with Seversky on previous aircraft, assumed leadership of the project. When Army officials expressed concerns about liquid-cooled engine availability, Republic shifted focus to the air-cooled Pratt Whitney double Wasp R2800 engine. This power plant generated over 2,000 horsepower, but consumed nearly double the fuel of the Allison. Kartveli incorporated elements from Seversky's earlier radial engine designs, creating an aircraft that borrowed heavily from the P-43's configuration. The substantially more powerful engine enabled Republic to dramatically increase the fighter's weight, making it the heaviest single-seat fighter yet constructed. Aircraft performance principles dictate that climb rate directly correlates to excess power available at any given airspeed. The XP-47's increased weight resulted in a slower climb rate than typically required for interceptor duties. However, by the time Thunderbolts entered combat, interceptor requirements had diminished, and the aircraft's heavy weight provided other advantageous characteristics, including superior diving speed and exceptional resistance to battle damage. The Thunderbolt truly earned the frequently misused descriptor rugged. Air-cooled engines proved less susceptible to combat failure since they lacked coolant systems vulnerable to battle damage leaks. The 56th Pursuit Group became the first U.S. Army unit to operate P-47s, conveniently stationed near Republic's Farmingdale factory. One squadron operated directly from the factory airfield, while others were based at Bridgeport, Connecticut, and Bendix, New Jersey. Initially equipped with Bell P-39s and Curtiss P-40s, the 56th began receiving Thunderbolts in spring 1942, coinciding with Captain Hubert Hub Zemke's assignment to the group following his return from an observer tour in Russia. Zemke's reputation would become inseparably linked with the P-47. The first overseas P-47s didn't arrive until early 1943, more than a year after the U.S. Army Air Corps entered combat. Previously, the burden of Axis engagement had fallen to P-39s and P-40s in the Pacific, and P-38s, P-40s, plus British Supermarine Spitfires and Hawker Hurricanes in Europe and North Africa. The initial American fighters sent to England were Lockheed P-38s, but North African operations absorbed them all, leaving only Spitfires for bomber escort missions over occupied Europe. The Agile Spitfire had earned outstanding fighter credentials during the 1940 Battle of Britain, but lacked sufficient range for long-range bomber escort duties. Spitfires could barely venture beyond the English Channel without extended-range fuel tanks, and even with tanks, their range remained severely limited. The veteran 56th, redesignated as a fighter group, arrived in England in early 1943 but delayed combat entry until April. 8th Fighter Command determined that aircraft modifications, including additional armor, and pilot combat training were necessary before entering battle. When the 56th Fighter Group reached England, 2 fighter groups were already present. The 78th Fighter Group had deployed with P-38s but lost them and most pilots to North African operations, leaving remaining pilots without aircraft. Both the 78th and 4th Fighter Groups began re-equipping with Thunderbolts. The 4th Fighter Group comprised former American Eagle Squadron pilots who had volunteered with the British Royal Air Force before America's war entry. These pilots universally loved the Spitfire and developed an almost passionate hatred for the Thunderbolt. Like their British RAF counterparts, these young Americans considered the Spitfire the greatest fighter ever built, a belief more emotionally than factually grounded. They were deeply unhappy about exchanging their light, maneuverable mounts for the world's heaviest fighter. 4th Fighter Group pilots derisively nicknamed their new aircraft 7-ton milk bottles, referencing the fuselage shape. However, contrary to some writers' assertions, the P-47's milk jug configuration didn't inspire its eventual nickname. Many pilots, believing they were being sacrificed, began calling the P-47 a juggernaut, naturally shortened to Jug. Initial Thunderbolt missions consisted of advanced training flights over German-occupied territory as theater orientation for pilots. Initially, German fighter pilots largely ignored Allied fighter formations, focusing instead on bombers. The P-47's first encounter with German fighters occurred on April 15, 1943, when Don Blakesley, a former Eagle Squadron pilot with the 4th Fighter Group, successfully approached a Focke-Wulf FW-190 in a dive and shot it down. Diving represented the P-47's greatest asset. Its heavy weight and massive, powerful engine enabled rapid acceleration. Nevertheless, Blakesley's aircraft assessment remained less than enthusiastic. He reportedly commented, "It ought to dive. It sure can't climb." Mission results favored the enemy. 1 Thunderbolt was shot down and 2 others lost to engine failure, a problem plaguing early P-47 operations. Engine problems weren't unique to Thunderbolts during combat introduction. Both P-38s and P-51s suffered high engine failure rates until problems were identified and corrected. On May 4, 1943, P-47s received their first escort assignment when 117 Thunderbolts from all 3 groups escorted B-17s and B-24s attacking Antwerp and Paris. Fighter escort would remain the primary Thunderbolt mission throughout 1943. Unfortunately, despite P-47s having much greater range than RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes, they still lacked range for deep German penetration. The Luftwaffe concentrated fighter strength inside Germany, waiting until Allied fighter escorts reached their range limits before striking bombers. During summer 1943, B-17 losses mounted to the point where the 8th Air Force temporarily abandoned daylight, deep penetration missions into Germany. The only immediate solution involved extending P-47 range, as they were the only available fighters until P-38s could reach England. Range was limited by fuel capacity, so the solution required increasing fuel load. External tanks, called drop tanks because they could be jettisoned, provided the simplest means of extending fighter operational range. Initial external tank development encountered problems. Resin-impregnated paper tanks leaked and couldn't transfer fuel at high altitudes because they weren't pressurized. Lieutenant Colonel Cass Huff, 8th Fighter Command's flight testing officer, developed tank pressurization using the airplane's vacuum system. Initial tanks carried only 75 gallons, with availability problems. To address supply and demand issues, 8th Fighter Command adopted British-developed paper tanks holding 108 gallons, allowing Thunderbolts to penetrate 325 miles into occupied territory. This still wasn't sufficient for Berlin missions. One range extension solution involved equipping aircraft with partially filled, unpressurized 200-gallon external drop tanks, using their contents during climb to altitude. This aerodynamically sound practice allowed fighters to utilize slower climb airspeeds and reduced parasitic drag. The procedure enabled Thunderbolts to reach altitude without drop tanks, but with nearly full internal tanks and clean wings, permitting higher speeds and increased range. This technique initially surprised German fighter pilots and resulted in several Thunderbolt victories. While the 4th, 56th and 78th Fighter Groups entered European combat with P-47s. The 348th Fighter Group deployed to the Southwest Pacific to join the famous 5th Air Force. Unlike 8 Fighter Command, which saw little 1942 combat, V Fighter Command pilots had battled the Japanese since early 1942. Some pilots had been in the Philippines when war broke out, experiencing combat since the beginning. Upon the group's arrival, 5th Air Force Commander Lt. General George C. Kenney orchestrated a scheme to boost new arrivals' morale and earn veterans' respect for the heavy Thunderbolt, particularly among P-38 pilots. He arranged a mock dogfight between 348th Commander Lt. Col. Neel Kearby and Major Tommy Lynch, then the 5th Air Force's highest-scoring ace. The night before the fight, Kenney advised Kearby to avoid alcohol and sleep early, knowing Lynch would do the opposite. The next morning, Kearby demonstrated the skills that would place him among the war's top-scoring fighter pilots. P-47 pilots received a morale boost, and P-38 pilots decided the new arrivals would be campaign assets rather than the liabilities they had imagined. Kearby and his pilots adopted tactics successfully used by P-40 pilots against the Japanese, attacking in dives, then breaking away from enemy formations and refusing to engage lightweight, highly maneuverable Japanese fighters in dogfights. Kearby taught his men to use dive inertia to zoom back to altitude for additional attacks. Similar techniques were also adopted in Europe. Pacific combat's long overwater legs required increased range, making drop tanks high priority. Of all American World War II combat units, the 5th Air Force was undoubtedly the most innovative, with an engineering department at Brisbane that was second to none. While 110-gallon tanks originally developed for P-39s and P-40s were available, V Fighter Command wanted greater capacity. The 5th Air Force Depot developed a 200-gallon, low-profile tank that met requirements. Despite limited range compared to P-38s, P-47s proved successful Pacific fighters. Thunderbolts replaced P-40s and P-39s in veteran 35th and 49th Fighter Groups and in 1/8th Group Squadron. Some V Fighter Command pilots weren't enthusiastic about the Thunderbolt, but others were. Lt. Col. Neel Kearby was undoubtedly the theater's leading P-47 pilot and one of the war's top-scoring aces. Unfortunately, he contracted bong fever, a condition causing fighter pilots to become obsessed with matching the score of American ace of aces Major Bong, who had replaced Tommy Lynch at the top when Lynch was killed in action. Kearby drove himself to shoot down Japanese aircraft, as did many other American aces. While competition undoubtedly led to countless Japanese aircraft destruction, it also caused young fighter pilots to take dangerous risks, and many lost their lives. Kearby died when apparently shot down in a dogfight in May 1944 after leading his wingman in an attack on a Kawasaki Type 48 bomber formation. Kearby shot down one, his wingmen each got another, then they were jumped by aggressive Japanese fighters, and Kearby was shot down. He was last seen hanging in his parachute but was never heard from again. His aircraft wreckage was found in March 1946. P-47s ranked second only to the Lockheed P-38 Lightning in Southwest Pacific operations. While the P-38's longer range made it the preferred choice for deep bomber escort missions into Japanese territory, P-47s carried their share by maintaining combat air patrols over Allied airfields and escorting transports and light and medium bombers on shorter-range missions. New Guinea became where the Army Air Forces developed close air support tactics for ground troops, and P-47s were soon adapted to this role alongside air-to-air combat. P-47 Thunderbolt range limitations were largely due to Army Air Corps operating procedures. Pilots were taught to operate aircraft at high RPMs and high manifold pressure, being told that excessive mixture leaning could damage cylinders. While essentially true, most pilots failed to lean as much as possible, consuming fuel at high rates. In summer 1944, famed aviator Charles Lindbergh visited the Southwest Pacific during a fact-finding tour as a United Aircraft Factory representative, builders of the Vought F-4U Corsair fighter. Previously, Lindbergh had worked as an unpaid Ford Motor Company consultant, becoming involved with the Thunderbolt, particularly in high-altitude flight research. Lindbergh became intimately acquainted with the P-47 and was shocked beyond belief when he arrived in the Pacific and discovered Army pilots were using techniques leading to drastically high fuel consumption. When he returned to New Guinea after visiting General Kenny in Brisbane, Lindbergh ferried a P-47 back to the forward area. A base operations officer, an experienced P-47 pilot, refused to approve his flight plan calling for a non-stop Brisbane to New Guinea flight. But Lindbergh knew exactly how much fuel he would use and arrived with fuel to spare, a feat that amazed young Army pilots. Soon, Lindbergh was teaching fuel management techniques to P-38 and P-47 pilots, helping increase V Fighter Command's effective combat range. Lindbergh knew that reducing propeller RPMs while maintaining manifold pressure would reduce fuel consumption and considerably increase aircraft range. In early 1944, Thunderbolts began appearing over China. The first P-47 group in the China-Burma-India theater was the 33rd Fighter Group, a historic group that began North African combat flying P-40s, then transferred to the Asian theater after the Sicily campaign. The 33rd was joined by the 81st Fighter Group, which had also entered North African combat with P-39s. Both groups transferred to the CBI as part of several Mediterranean Combat Group deployments to India supporting British Brigadier Ord Wingate's Chindit expedition into Burma. While the 33rd equipped with both P-47s and P-38s, the 81st was an all-Thunderbolt outfit from its February India arrival. The 80th Fighter Group began CBI combat operations with P-40s and P-38s, then equipped with Thunderbolts in spring 1944. The 33rd Group flew P-47s only until November 1944, when it became an all-P-38 outfit. The 1st Air Commando Group, a composite unit organized in India in early 1944, included 2 fighter squadrons starting with an older North American P-51 version, then transitioning to P-47s later that year. Thunderbolts were also active in the Central Pacific. Due to long distances between regional land bases, the first P-47s seeing Marianas duty arrived aboard escort carriers Manila Bay and Natoma Bay. They belonged to the 318th Fighter Group, transferring to Micronesia from Hawaii. Although the convoy, including both carriers, was attacked by Japanese dive bombers, all 111 P-47s were delivered to Saipan's Slido airfield, where they immediately supported ground forces invading the island. Close air support of ground troops began in the Southwest Pacific in summer 1942, when modified Douglas A-20 Havoc light bombers began strafing Japanese positions opposing Australian troops on Papua New Guinea's Kokoda Tract. General Kenny was so impressed with these tactics that he instructed fighter groups under his command to develop ground attack tactics as well. When American forces landed in North Africa in late 1942, 12th Air Force Commander Lt. General James H. Doolittle restricted light and medium bombers to medium-altitude attacks and assigned close air support roles to fighters because German air opposition was declining. RAF pilots taught Americans close air support intricacies. Fighter-bomber success in the Southwest Pacific and North Africa led to ground attack tactics development within all numbered Air Force fighter commands, with one exception. Air Corps doctrine called for each numbered Air Force, equivalent to an Army, to be multifunctional, with fighter, bomber, and troop carrier commands. The exception was the 8th Air Force, which had switched from multifunctional to single-purpose command when most fighter groups and all troop carrier groups were sent to North Africa in 1942. Daylight precision bombing had become the 8th mission, and 8 Fighter Command's role was ensuring bombers reached and returned from targets. With no Allied ground troops in occupied Europe, there was no one for whom to provide close air support. 8 Fighter Command did, however, begin developing ground attack tactics against locomotives, airfields, and other targets. The first 8 Fighter Command strafing attack occurred accidentally when a P-47 pilot suffered damage and was forced to low altitude over France. He strafed a locomotive during the return flight to England. In early 1944, 8 Fighter Command fighters began dropping to deck level to attack Luftwaffe airfields and other targets after completing escort missions. In March 1944, 8 Fighter Commander Brig. General Bill Kepner authorized establishing a special P-47 squadron to develop strafing techniques. For a month, pilots from 4 groups experimented with low-level mock raids on their own airfields. Then they carried out operations in France. They would approach high, then dive to treetop altitudes about 20 miles from targets, reaching strafing altitude approximately 5 miles out. On April 12th, the special unit disbanded and pilots returned to their groups to teach squadron mates new tactics. 8 Fighter Command began scheduling regular fighter sweeps. After German defeat in North Africa and Sicily and Italy invasions, the Allies began focusing on Western European invasion, where close air support of ground troops would be a major Army Air Force's mission. Invasion planning called for 9th Air Force transfer from the Mediterranean to England to become a tactical air force, along with creating a new 15th Air Force to control heavy bombers operating from Italy. The plan also included converting the 12th Air Force to the tactical role. By early 1944, P-47s were being produced at unprecedented rates, and many new fighter groups were equipping with them. Simultaneously, however, a redesigned North American P-51 Mustang fighter version was proving suitable for long-range escort missions, and P-47 units destined for the 8th Air Force began converting to P-51s before overseas deployment. Consequently, the Army Air Forces began assigning P-47 groups to the newly organized XV Tactical Air Command of the 9th Air Force. Early 1944 witnessed a major European strategy shift as the 8th Air Force was placed under direct command of Supreme Allied Commander U.S. Army General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower decreed that German Air Force destruction was the Air Corps' main priority, a decision leading to 8 Fighter Command tactical switches from fighter escort to fighter sweeps, including ground attack. Allied air commanders wisely realized that destroyed enemy aircraft were destroyed aircraft, regardless of whether destruction occurred in air-to-air combat or during strafing or bombing attacks on fighter fields. This principle, adopted by the Southwest Pacific's 5th Air Force, whose fighter pilots had been shooting down Japanese fighters and bombers at far greater rates than their European peers, was implemented in 1942. Kenny couldn't have cared less if his fighter pilots shot down enemy planes in the air or knocked them out on the ground. Finally, nearly a year and a half after Kenny adopted this tactic, European air commanders were forced to do the same. The P-47 would become the centerpiece for European ground attack. While highly effective, the ground attack role was hazardous for both plane and pilot, and many Thunderbolts were lost to German anti-aircraft fire. The 50 caliber guns in Thunderbolt wings were lethal enough, but the Air Corps developed new weapons to bolster fighter-bomber destructive power. Hardpoints were installed to allow carrying high-explosive bombs or tubes for firing high-velocity aerial rockets, a U.S. Navy development adopted by the Army. Napalm, a jellied gasoline mixture, was used to firebomb enemy troop concentrations. Operating at deck level, fighter bombers, including P-38s and P-51s as well as P-47s, attacked enemy airfields, locomotives, and trucks. Fighter bombers operated in close support of ground forces, attacking enemy troop and tank columns and artillery positions. The fighter-bomber concept proved so destructive that in China, where every fuel drop had to be air transported across the Himalayas from India, B-24s previously used in strategic roles were removed from combat operations and assigned to transport duty. The reasoning was that fuel they consumed could be better used moving fuel for fighter bombers. P-47 Thunderbolts served with many nations, including Brazil and Mexico. The British Royal Air Force operated Thunderbolts in Asia. Thunderbolts equipped 6 French Air Force fighter groups after Vichy French defeat in North Africa. Although Thunderbolt accomplishments have been overshadowed in post-war media and press by more glamorous Mustangs, the fighters that became known as Jugs performed admirably throughout World War II's last 3 years. If the term workhorse should be applied to any Allied fighter of World War II, the Thunderbolt aircraft well deserves the title. The P-47 story represents more than just another successful warplane. It embodies the triumph of practical engineering over aesthetic appeal, of rugged reliability over elegant design. While the sleek P-51 Mustang captured public imagination with its graceful lines and impressive performance statistics, the stocky Thunderbolt quietly carried the heaviest burden of America's air war. From the windswept airfields of England to the steaming jungles of New Guinea, from the desert campaigns of North Africa to the island-hopping battles of the Central Pacific, the P-47 proved itself again and again. Its pilots may have initially cursed its weight and bulk, but they soon came to appreciate the qualities that brought them home. The ability to absorb tremendous battle damage, the devastating firepower of 8.50 caliber machine guns, and the raw power that could outrun most enemies in a dive. Perhaps most importantly, the Thunderbolt pioneered the fighter-bomber concept that would dominate military aviation for decades to come. Today's multi-role fighters trace their lineage directly back to those early P-47s that learned to balance air superiority missions with ground attack operations. In an era when specialization was the norm, the Thunderbolt proved that versatility could be a virtue. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt may not have possessed the sleek beauty of its contemporaries, but it possessed something more valuable: the ability to get the job done, no matter how difficult or dangerous. In the crucible of World War II, that reliability proved more precious than any aesthetic consideration. The Jug earned its place in history not through glamour, but through sheer, determined service to the cause of victory.